All right, should be recording now. So today we have Beyond Belief joining us. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
No, brilliant. Yeah. So I've sort of been on this like corner of the internet, as I like to think of it, for the last sort of 6 or 7 months, I think now. So I sort of started up a blog then because I was working as a youth pastor, and sort of over the course of that year, I basically, different terms, sort of deconverted, deconstructed, kind of left behind the faith that I had before. And so, I kind of ended up leaving that a little bit early, and sort of started blogging about sort of some of my reflections about theology and the church, and sort of that experience of going through that. And then, joined Twitter and some lovely people through that, which has been great fun.
Yeah, some lovely people, but also some really frustrating people too.
Oh yeah, great mix.
Yeah, I think I saw you you retweeted with a comment that one there's like that picture of John Calvin, and he called you he was like name calling you and stuff like that. He's like,
yeah, that one came about out of the blue as well, because normally I feel like you can spot them from a distance. You can usually sort of, if they're using all caps or something, you can tell, well, they're going to be trouble. Whereas that one threw me off a little bit, because at first he sort of seemed to be, having like quite a nice little conversation, and then sort of out of the blue, commented on one of my posts with a bit of an insult. So I thought, I'm not really going to respond to that.
Whenever people do that, I sometimes just put neat. Like that's my one word response to people when they do stuff like that.
When I sort of started out and was not quite aware of how rude people can be on the internet, I tried a few different things, like a little thumbs up emoji or something just, you've acknowledged them and you're going to calmly move on.
Right.
I think that one in particular, I did like the little smiley face with love hearts.
Or like a kissing emoji. Yeah. Like, I've done that before. Because I don't know, because like I joined Twitter and I didn't know how to handle some of that stuff too, but it's kind of fun, like not in a mean way, but it's kind of fun trolling the trolls a little bit.
It's fire with fire, isn't it? That's how they say you're supposed to fight it. But yeah, I've like some people, I think, I'll just completely ignore them.
Yeah.
But then others, I think, have a little bit of fun with this and then go past it.
Yeah. That's interesting though. I mean, at least in my own case, I wasn't a youth pastor, but I was helping out with like the youth group and stuff. And I taught like Sunday school and everything. And I mean, I kind of moved I was like in a Southern Baptist context, like in the United States, and moved to more like Reformed theology and Calvinism. And it was interesting. But what was your religious background and upbringing like?
Yeah, well, I think probably quite different from Southern Baptist, I imagine.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've sort of realized as well since interacting with people from the US is quite how different churches generally are, sort of, across the pond. And the way I sort of describe it generally is that I feel like everything that happens in America kind of filters through to England maybe like a decade later, and then we sort of tone it down a little bit. And I feel like that works with a lot of like church things as well. So we'll have like a sort of breadth of, we'll have like Pentecostal kind of expressions and Reformed expressions, but they're sort of usually a bit less extreme. I mean, mine in particular it was Church of England, so it was quite. It's difficult. I mean, I say quite standard, but then it's like standard to who? Like it was,
right.
It was standard to my upbringing, but I guess to some others it could be a lot more charismatic than they're used to, or a lot less. So it was sort of charismatic-ish. Is one way of describing it. So we had during worship people would maybe put their hands up to show that they were into it, and some people might sing in tongues, but there wasn't a big thing made about it. It was quite just like a middle class church setting, really. Nothing too exciting, but also, I mean, again, I guess one difference I think possibly between how our sort of church backgrounds might be is there wasn't like a heavy predestination sort of idea or those sort of more Calvinist teachings. I'd say it probably would have been, I mean, they wouldn't have sort of necessarily used this language, but it was more of like an Arminian, I suppose, kind of idea. And, a bit nicer, like a nicer kind of polite church, I think is the best way to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading some of your blog too, just comparing, like, I mean, I wasn't I moved, my upbringing was more kind of within pop evangelicalism. So we kind of moved from church to church, and then I settled like in college, like in a Southern Baptist context. It wasn't like I don't know what stereotypes you have in your head of that, but it may not have met all of those stereotypes.
Right.
But, yeah, that's interesting. Did you have any, before, obviously you deconverted, but like as you were a Christian, were there any major like evolutions in the way you thought about, theology or anything like that?
Yeah. I think it just gradually got a bit looser.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the big thing I think for me, because a lot of the stuff I didn't really question. Like I sort of read the Bible from quite a young age. From about like 14 was when I first sort of started reading through properly. I decided to like cover to cover, and so I finished it in 4 years. So by the time I was 18, I'd managed to get through it sort of one time through. But at that point, I guess you don't really think too much about like theology, and you sort of just go with what your church does.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I guess a lot of the time in youth group, like they don't really explicitly teach things. So like, they don't teach theology. They kind of teach about how you are in the world, or like about things like your relationship with Jesus and stuff. But like, there's no major like theological paradigms that you then would sort of shift from, in a sense. So I think it was almost like a way of forming them. And then like, how did I sort of go about forming them?
See, you just fell away because you didn't have the proper doctrine,
Well, exactly. if I'd been brought up properly with all the right theology, I'd still be, front and center at church right now. Well, probably not right now. But
right.
Yeah. So I think, for example, I mean, I never had a particularly like the classic ones, like creationism or views on that. That was never a big thing for me. Like I can't remember. I mean, maybe I did when I was younger, but I can't remember ever like not accepting evolution or anything like that. Like I think I wouldn't necessarily have known why at the time. Like I probably wouldn't have been able to articulate why I sort of accepted certain things over others. But yeah, we didn't have the sort of staunch inerrantist kind of view where like 6-day creation, like literal flood and all of that kind of stuff. Like some people in church did. It wasn't that we were completely past that, but it wasn't like a mainstream teaching that we had to accept.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there were, in a sense, there were no sort of major shifts. I think there was sort of ebbs and flows sort of over my time sort of studying at university, when I sort of started to think more about some things and reflect on how I approached them. But I think, until the actual sort of process of like the year or so when I was stepping away, I think is when the big changes took place.
Yeah, it's interesting just thinking about that. Like, it seems like when Christians evaluate why people are falling away, there's like, on the one hand, I was making a joke, but there's on the one hand people that are basically like, obviously they fell away because you didn't give them the right theology, you didn't give them the right doctrine. But then there's the other people that are like, no, it's because you're forcing these heavy-handed beliefs on them. And when those beliefs collapse, then the whole thing collapses. So it's like you have these two competing parties trying to explain the people falling away. And
you can't get it right, can you?
Right. It's like, but they have to, justify it because Christianity is true, and they have to figure out why people are falling.
Yeah.
So, I think that's
and it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've seen that a few times as well. Like when you see sort of blog posts saying like, the reason people fell away is because they didn't have the right theology, which basically means they didn't have our theology.
Right.
Which I also find interesting, because I think, well, like I'm being presented with your theology now, and I still find it lacking. So I'm not sure why, like, the only reason that I would have not fallen away from having experienced that younger is because I wouldn't have been able to question it then. So It's not that it actually makes more sense. It's just that you're saying, no, I should have given you my theology at a young age, but you weren't able to question it, and you'll be in exactly the same place I am now. Should
have ingrained it into your brain earlier. Downloaded it. So I mean, to be fair, they would say usually the people that harp on like the right theology are usually people that would say that people truly fall away because they didn't have the Holy Spirit or something. But they will still, interestingly enough, place a lot of emphasis on the practical, like raising kids up in the faith and having these beliefs beaten in their head. I guess they probably wouldn't like me saying that, but that's basically what it is a lot of times. But so what started to lead you down the path to deconversion? Like as you started questioning and going through all that?
Yeah, I think I've obviously been reflecting on this quite a lot, and I think there's like three strands probably that I think kind of, because there was no sort of like one moment or like one event,
right?
But I think there were like three kind of things that led to that place. One of them probably was my studies. So I started, went to university at 20, so I had a couple of gap years doing youth work as an internship for a church, and I went off to it was an evangelical university, so it was, so it had like good academic credentials. It wasn't sort of, just middle of nowhere, like Bible Belt kind of indoctrination school. It was like it was a very good university, but it meant that I was actually kind of thinking about stuff a lot more, because it's one thing to I realize it's like when I'm chatting with some people online, and they're sort of coming back at me of like, oh no, you've clearly not read this. I think, well, it's one thing to read it. Like, it's one thing to sort of read the Bible, because I had, like I said, when I was 14, I sort of read through the Bible. I think it's quite another to sort of think about, well, how did this come about? Like, what are the different competing theologies that you find within there? Like, how do you approach the Bible generally? And I think it was doing that at university which then made me question it a little bit more. So yeah, one thing I think, and a big one, because like I said, I never really had like a full inerrant kind of view, but I still had this kind of idea that surely the Old Testament, for the most part, is historical. Like beyond Genesis 11 or whatever, when you get to Abraham, like, yeah, surely that's, there was a guy called Abraham that did this stuff, and actually, like, for and one of the things that I credit the university with is, even though they sort of had like an evangelical point of view, they were very good at actually presenting the other, like, different understandings. So, rather than just like the conquest of Canaan, they sort of had the other view, like the peasants' revolt, or like these other kind of understandings. And I remember I learned in one class that supposedly when the Canaanites were going to, the Israelites were going to capture Jericho, the archaeological findings were apparently Jericho had been uninhabited for like 200 years by that point. So it raises the question, who exactly were they conquering? And it's just a few things like that led me to lose a bit of trust in like the Old Testament, beyond the ones that, I never really sort of, the poetic kind of understanding of creation. So in a way, actually, to your earlier question, maybe one of the paradigm shifts I did have, one of the different views, was maybe how I approached the Bible. And actually, but again, that was quite a gradual sort of losing trust in it. And then I guess partnered with that, like a second thing, is I started to realize that I was quite glad that I was losing trust in it, because I didn't really like the God that I found within the Bible, especially because again, you see it quite a lot in like the debates about the things on genocide and the treatment of slaves and women and all of that. And I think previously you kind of just take it on faith, don't you? You think, well, like, God is good. Like, I'm sure there's an answer. I'm sure there's a reason. But there were a few passages as well that just, I remember even at the time reading them, even just like my early Christian days, and really struggling with them. One in particular always strikes me. I can't remember exactly where it is. I think it's possibly Numbers or something. And it's when the Israelites left Egypt, and they're in the wilderness, and yes, it's after it must be Exodus, after the golden calf incident, and basically the Levites get their prime position, like as the priests of the Lord, by slaughtering all of their friends and family, like, and that's what Yahweh commanded, like this idea of the purity of the covenant and making sure that we get rid of anyone who would not want to follow it. And there's that quite chilling verse where Yahweh basically says, go through among your brothers and sisters, slaughtering anyone who does not. And even as a Christian, things like that, I thought,
Yahweh loves you.
What is good? I don't really know how to justify that at that point. So I sort of lost, I lost trust in the Bible to actually like have any kind of accurate sort of historical and even like theological kind of representations. Then the flip side of that was I then was not a huge fan of the character of God. And then like a big one for me that was like a catalyst for a lot of it, because in a way those were kind of more distanced, not entirely just intellectual, because I mean, if you're sort of in a worship service and you're singing praises to God, you kind of want to believe that God actually is good. So those things do affect you on more than like just an intellectual level. But like a big catalyst for me was like coming out as gay, like aged 18.
Mm-hmm.
And when I sort of went to university and was in a fairly conservative environment, I kind of became aware that it was, I wasn't like that open, but I was aware that even though people would be fine with me as a person,
right,
like they would not be fine with me, you know, having a relationship or pursuing that, as the Christians would say it. And so that led to huge kind of questions about, well, you know, why would God have a problem with this? And I think that brought it onto quite a personal level. So it wasn't just questions about like theology or the Bible. It then became quite a big question about, you know, if I'm in a relationship with God, like what kind of a relationship is that? Like, is it one where, you know, he's arbitrarily restricting things without like providing justification, without any sort of seeming reason behind it? So I think those are some of the factors that kind of, if it was just one of them without the others, maybe I wouldn't have gone the way I've gone. But I think that the fact that those three things kind of tied in together sort of led me to question things a lot more substantially.
Well, God says so, and don't question it.
That's true. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because it's almost like, excuse me, it's almost like Christians almost have like an unfalsifiable view of like God's goodness. So like basically you could, whatever you bring up, if you take a certain approach to the Bible, then I've written about this and made a video about it too, but it's like the idea, I mean, if you had an explicit verse where Yahweh commanded rape, I mean, there are morally gray areas in the Bible where he's like, take virgin women as captives. You know, people argue about that, but like you could have that kind of clear command. And if you have a certain approach to the Bible, then you're going to, you know, justify it no matter what, because that's what everyone else is doing with all the other verses. So why would you think it's going to stop there? It's just imagine a scenario where there was some other morally heinous stuff that's not in the Bible that could be. And you know that the people that have that approach to the text would just rationalize that away. So it's like, if someone already has that starting point, all you can really do is kind of pile on the cognitive dissonance, I think, you know, like by trying to point out that stuff.
No, it's very true. And it's interesting because like, why do we even think God is good in the first place? I mean, it's usually because of like what God says about himself, or like what people say about, rather than what he does, which is very different to how we would normally get the idea of someone's goodness. Because, you know, you normally say someone's good because of what they do, because of what you sort of, the evidence is how that plays out. Rather than just, you know, I often think like if you came across someone who was like kicking a puppy and they said to you, no, it's okay, like I'm good. Which we're just like, oh, all right, well, if you say so. But like that's when we approach the Bible, like we say, oh, God is good because like the Bible says God is good. But like, is what God does actually good? And like you say, like there's different approaches to that, and people rationalize it in different ways. And because you like the classic one is like, for example, if you take the genocide one, you get I'm interested, for example, in the different approaches between, because I got Paul Copan's book, I can't remember what it's called, but you know, the defense of that.
Yahweh.
I've also been following also been following Randall Rouser, who I actually have a lot of respect for.
Same.
I do appreciate his approach, and I listened to watch the video that you did with him as well, and I've listened to him on a few podcasts. And I think like I have a great respect for the way he approached it, but at the same time I also think like it goes down the other side, basically, where he's still trying to justify it, but whereas someone like Paul Copan might say, you know, God was justified in killing these people because they were bad people, you know. they were all, without exception, they were all performing child sacrifice, and they were all basically Hitler up to 11, like, you know. So maybe not exactly, but that's the kind of justification. Someone like Randall Rouser would sort of perhaps downplay or just have a different interpretation of how important those verses are. And I think he approached them via, I can't remember who, is it like Augustine's or someone's view, but basically he reads it through Jesus. So like, is it something that Jesus would do in terms of how we love our neighbors? And if it's not, then we would have to read it differently. And I think that's great, but then like the difficulty I always find with that, with people who then have Jesus as their standard, is I say, well, that makes sense, because, you know, within Christian theology, Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. So if you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus. But then Jesus seems to affirm the Old Testament
Right.
quite a lot. Like there's no point at which he says, well, he always does say, you've heard it said, but I say this. Like, well, that's the Sermon on the Mount, isn't it? But that's always to give a slightly stricter command. He never says, you've heard it said in the Old Testament that God said it's okay to kill people and take over their land, but I say, be nice instead. Like he never takes the opportunity which you'd have thought God would want to do if that's what he's actually like, to sort of clear up some of the stuff that happened in part one of his book.
That's where we get into the thing where like the different depictions of Jesus in the Gospels, because I think there's people like in Matthew, I believe he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I said you love your enemies. And so I think a lot of people will look to that and say that's exactly what Jesus is doing. He's reversing the Old Testament, of exclusion and blah, blah, blah. But even if you do that, and there's still other, like you said, there's other problematic passages where he seems to clearly affirm, like, I forget which one it is, but there's a passage where he's talking about the law and like stoning rebellious children to death. And he kind of, basically and I remember, I think either talking with Randall about that or having him, seeing him talk about that passage as well. But you kind of have to be like, well, Jesus was just trying to make a point and blah, blah, blah. Like he didn't really think that, like, I mean, maybe, but that's where like the interpretation of some of this stuff can get, I guess, hairy, because I do understand, I'm sympathetic towards the view that in some ways, like the Sermon on the Mount tries to, because I don't think the Bible's inerrant, and I don't think there's a, unified picture of Jesus across all the Gospels. I do think that in some ways, in some places, Jesus is depicted as more progressive in the Old Testament, but there's others where it's clearly doesn't seem like he's moved on from it. So I guess it just depends on how you, and the thing you're saying, like, in a way, like the more, I guess you would say, I won't say liberal leaning kind of Christians, they don't have to justify biblical violence in that it actually happened, but they still have to justify that it's in the text for some reason. And
and that's like, I don't, maybe, and I admit, like, maybe sometimes I just take quite a black and white approach. Like, I think sometimes that is just the way I think. So I do have to try and get out of that mindset sometimes. But there's part of me that just thinks, if the Old Testament says God commanded this, and if Jesus sort of affirms the Old Testament and sort of says, the Holy Spirit spoke through the prophets, and not one word of the law will be whatever, then I think, well, at the bottom line, how do you get away from that? That's the difficulty I find. Like there's you can have the different sort of theological lenses and such, but I think at the bottom line, either it's completely wrong, like they said God commanded this, but they just were not hearing from God at all. Or what point, like when do you then say that is God? Like other than if you just say if you scrap most of the Old Testament entirely, like it's, I don't know. I find it difficult.
Right.
And I can understand why people would spend a lot of time trying to reconcile it, because they kind of have to.
Right.
Like, the joy of not believing it anymore is you can just look at it and be like, well, it's just human. Like that. It just is. Whereas if you believe in if that's the center of your life and you've got to make it work, then you will come up with all of these kind of interpretive frameworks to try and help you make sense of God and still hold to some kind of idea of a good God and some kind of biblical authority, but I've not seen one that I think would work for me, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's why it's kind of, again, and not everything is falsifiable in principle, but again, once you stop talking about like the objective features in the text themselves and start to just say like it's inspired, and then basically what you mean by inspiration can basically take any punches that are thrown at it and can't be falsified, then it's at that point you have to take, like, so for someone, if their doctrine of inspiration doesn't rely on objective features in the text, like that I can point to show that it's from God, and it's more like, you have this sense of the Holy Spirit telling you it's inspired and you just work it out after the fact. Like the way that I approach it is more like, okay, look, and it's kind of like what you're saying where it's human, but the way I would frame it is if you can explain all these texts by just appealing to human beings, then you don't need to add the additional divine hand to the picture. The human explanation is simple, like the merely human explanation, because what they'll say is, well, God used humans, failed human or flawed humans. But the point is, like, what's the simpler explanation? That is just a human book or collection of texts, or that it's human and flawed and then like plus God? Like, it's kind of like, I'm not comparing God to fairies, but like if you say, if someone's, because I don't think that's a good comparison, but if someone says like, how does the grass grow? And you say, well, fairies help the grass grow. And it's like, well, we understand how grass grows. We don't need to appeal to fairies in addition to like our scientific understanding of the grass. Well, I mean, that's how you would go about shaving off that unnecessary, additional hypothesis, is just to say, look, we already know in general, we have a good enough explanation of these texts without appealing to this extra thing. You don't need it.
And that's the thing, is it? Because I think most people then, like, they hold the views they hold, not because, like, they start with the Bible and they try and work out, like, oh, well, what makes best sense of this? But they'll start with their faith, and then they'll be presented with the Bible. And, because of the faith that they already have, they then have to make that work.
Right.
So yeah, like if you looked at it purely from like if you had no understanding of Christianity before, and you'd been brought up somewhere where it just wasn't a thing, and then you were met with the Bible and you read it through, you would probably think, yeah, okay, that's an interesting collection of like historic understandings of divinity, like, but you wouldn't think, oh, but there must have been like a divine hand behind it, like, that comes because that's part of church tradition that you grew up in, and therefore when you read the Bible, you have to try and make it work within that. And it's interesting, like you say, the different interpretations, like when you step away from like what's objectively in the text. I think, and this is me probably butchering theology because I was never that good at historical theology, but I remember listening to Bart Campolo, and part of his story I remember is he lost faith in or like lost trust in the Bible, like in the kind of inerrant understanding of it. But then his lecturer kind of pointed him towards Karl Barth, who, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his understanding is more like it becomes God's word as it's read. So it's not so much what's in the text, but like it's more of a subjective kind of idea of as you read it, and as because the word of God is, so he would hold, capital W word is Jesus, and therefore like the Bible is God's word as it testifies to Jesus. And so he then said, Bart Campolo said that he held on to that view for another like 20 years. He felt like it saved his faith, but now looking back, he's kind of frustrated because he's like, it felt like it wasted another 20 years of his time, that he, if it just completely shaved that off and got rid of any idea of like biblical authority before, it would have been a lot simpler. But people do try and grasp at some way of making it work. And I think that's what a lot of progressive Christianity is. We have this faith, like that's like it's a central part of who you are, and it's very painful to just get rid of entirely. So you have to like try and take away bit by bit and make it work. And I think that's where, a lot of that kind of comes about.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about Karl Barth, but I think, he kind of, his approach to the Bible and like divine inspiration is sort of analogous to like a lot of like really reformed Calvinists, but it basically like, it's like it's scripture self-authenticating, I think, in his view. But the thing is, his view untethers it from any objective features in the text. So again, it's more just like, you just have this self-authenticating, sense that it's from God, and you don't actually need anything else. Whereas like more like reformed people would say, like, yes, it's self-authenticating, but they would still argue that there are objective markers in the text that clearly show the unbelieving world that it's from God. So like, it seems to, if I'm understanding correctly, it seems like Karl Barth's view kind of moves, it's like that same kind of self-authenticating view, but kind of detaches itself from the obligation to defend the Bible in any way. And you know what I'm saying? Yeah,
no, I think so. Again, we did like an essay, or no, it was like a exam question, I think, on as part of our module on personal work of the Spirit, and one of the exam questions is about different views of inspiration. So I looked at it a bit there, but I'm not that clear. So anyone who's watching this that knows a lot about Karl Barth will probably be violently shaking their heads and being filled with rage as I entirely misrepresent him. So I feel like the less I say about it, the better.
Yeah. Kind of before we move on from like the biblical violence and different things, like it's interesting to me that like, and I think you've tweeted a little bit about like moral intuitions and maybe like objective versus subjective morality and stuff, but it seems like people like, so for example, like the traditional kind of moral arguments are basically like they move from like, if God exists, there's no objective moral facts. There are objective moral facts, therefore God exists, something like that. But it's funny, like, how do you know they're objective moral facts in the first place? Well, it really seems to you like there are. That would be the evidence, like the seeming that there are objective moral facts. So it's interesting to me that so many people like love the moral argument, but then when you try to show moral absurdities in the Bible, they're like, oh, your moral intuitions are unreliable. It's like, your whole like one of your favorite arguments depends on the fact that our moral intuitions are generally reliable and in contact with some kind of standard. So you can't really it just seems, it's silly to me, but I won't go on a rant about it.
No, I mean, and it's an error, because I never came across the moral argument when I was a Christian. So it's not something that like was ever part of my Christian faith. Like I don't think I'd ever heard of the phrase objective morality until like I joined Twitter like a few months ago. So that clearly was completely like outside of my radar. But it just made me think like it's not a good argument. Like you say, it doesn't really hold up. Like and as you say, I think the strongest sort of thing against it is pointing to the Bible. Like if there is, because people take it in two ways, don't they? So if they say there's objective morality, which again, and I've had a few chats with people since then, that even the terms objective and subjective aren't actually that helpful, because morality as a whole is very complicated, and to almost like make it black and white is difficult. But I don't understand a lot of this stuff. They'll say like it's objective either because it's in the text and that makes it objective, and therefore you just go with whatever's in the text, or it's written on your heart. So, but like you say, like if neither of them work, because if you say if it's in the text, then there's problematic things in the text. Like there's no consistent biblical morality, so you have to choose one thing over another. How do you choose that? Well, you could say you choose it based on the objective morality in your heart, but then if that's deceptive, how can you trust that? So as the apologists would like to say, it's a self-defeating argument. It doesn't. There's no real standard to lean it on. So I've never. Maybe I'm completely missing something. Maybe like, but I don't understand how people find I can understand why, if you do believe, you might believe in objective morality, that might come out of your belief. But I don't really understand how people get to Christianity from morality.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. So I mean, the way they usually use like the moral arguments is just to get to bare theism. But I think what you're saying is like they're like if you try to have that kind of view and then go to the Bible, like that just seems incompatible. Something along those lines. But,
well, I mean, more maybe that like I think if you believe in Christianity, then you would believe that presumably God does have some kind of morality that he would want everyone to abide by. In which case, that would be kind of the objective morality. So however it's presented, so I suppose if you believe in God, kind of as a part of that, I suppose you have to believe in objective morality. But for me, it seems like more something that comes as part of the package rather than like an argument that would lead you to that.
Okay.
Like, so it's like, if you're a Christian, you have to believe in heaven and hell or whatever, but you wouldn't necessarily argue for Christianity based on heaven and hell, So I think it's one of those things where I can understand why you would believe in objective morality if you're Christian, but it's problematic. But I find it very confusing why people would like actually take that as an argument and sort of try and parade it around. Like if I was a Christian, I'd probably be like, yeah, there's objective morality. Let's not talk about it too much, let's not dig into that. But then you get the apologists who are like, no, morality is objective, and that's why you must believe in God. So I just find it an interesting approach to apologetics.
Yeah. So it seems like a lot of your deconversion was not necessarily like, it was more Bible driven. Well, are you an atheist agnostic? Like, how do you identify in that way?
I generally try to slip past labels. And I've tried some on in the past, and I sometimes will refer to myself as something. And usually it'll depend on the context. So I might sort of use the term agnostic or atheist. But the problem is, like, one of the big arguments I often see, like on Twitter, is how those terms are used.
Right.
And that makes me think, like, well, are we just going down this rabbit hole that doesn't, like, we've got enough to consider, like, without having to try and work out. Because I think ultimately, whatever term you use, you're going to disagree with other people who use the same term. So if I call myself an atheist, there's going to be loads of other things that other people who consider themselves atheists and I are going to disagree on. And similarly with agnostics and stuff. And I think people understand, because some people consider agnostics those who just haven't yet made their mind up, whereas others might see them as those who've made a conscious decision that there's things that we can't know. Like some will say atheist is like, a deliberate rejection of God. Some will say it's just lacking a belief in a God. And I'm just quite happy to sidestep a lot of that and just say, I don't really believe in the Christian God, but beyond that, I'm not entirely sure. It's probably where I'm at.
Yeah, I was going to say it seems like your deconversion was more it wasn't really theism related. It was more like Bible Christianity specific,
Yeah. So maybe in some ways, I don't know. I guess I couldn't be a theist. I don't think, because again, I'm falling into the trap. But because theism, I think I did a post the other day about how I find deism a lot more, or deism. I don't know how you pronounce it even really, but a lot more feasible than theism, because I think theism comes along with this idea of like a personal God. So like a God who didn't just create things. And I'm like, okay, like I could maybe get behind that. I don't know. But I think it's the idea of when you have like a personal God who like has certain ways they want you to live. And like they are supposed to be involved in your life in some way. I think that's when things get a lot more problematic. And so I don't have like a major problem with the idea of there being a God or like a ground of being or something beyond like the material universe. I'm not sold that there is one, but also right. Like it's not like a big concern to me. It seems right. Like quite an abstract idea. But yeah, like for me, like you say, my deconversion was very much away from my understanding of Christianity that I was brought up in, and Christianity broader as well. Like I've aware that my sort of fairly tame evangelicalism that I grew up in is not the only approach to Christianity, and there are lots of other traditions, but I'm also not particularly sold on any other particular tradition either. So I'm not about to hop into like the Orthodox or the Catholic kind of understandings of Christianity either.
Yeah. So how has deconversion like affected your life, like practically, like the fact that you're not a Christian anymore?
Yeah, I think subconsciously before I kind of went down that route a bit more overtly, I tried to make as many steps as I could to make sure it wouldn't affect my life too much. Because I was working as a youth pastor at the time, but it was only for a year. It was like maternity cover. It was part-time. So like it already had an end date. It was going to end like that summer. And even going into it, I went into it a little bit tentatively, because and this was sort of September 2019, I think now, sort of when I started that. And I had not sort of put it to myself as the idea that I was deconstructing, but that's very much what I was doing. I wasn't aware that I was questioning the beliefs that I had to quite the level that I was, but I did go into the job thinking like, I'm not going to be a typical youth pastor because I'm not sure how much I believe the things that typical youth pastors do. And I think for some time by then already wanted to go into a bit more of like a teaching route, like in schools, like outside of, because I'd also thought about like doing like there was a worship pastor role that a vicar at a church I was at had sort of approached me and said, would you be interested in applying? At that point, I'd already sort of applied for the youth pastor one, so I sort of had to sort of put that to the side. But generally speaking, like church jobs, I realized there came a point where I thought, I'm not sure that's for me. Like I'm not sure that's going to work for me. But at the time, I hadn't quite articulated why. I think I knew that I maybe didn't feel that comfortable in that environment. Mm-hmm. So I mean, at the moment, I'm like training to be a teacher in a school, and you don't have to believe anything for that. Right. There's no sort of creed that you have to sign up to. Like people on my course, like some are Christians, some are atheists, like, and that's just not really a factor. So in terms of how it affected me, it was quite big. Like last year, I kind of became aware, I think, that I was deconstructing around like Easter time, like maybe a little before that. So it meant that I still kind of had 4 or 5 months left of the job where I was like, yeah, I don't think I believe this stuff, but I'm also having to like preach it and like teach, so I kind of stepped back after Easter. And by this point, things were all on Zoom anyway. Right. So we weren't really meeting as youth groups in person. We were kind of having Zoom meetings. But I was quite deliberate in that I arranged the rota so that I wasn't doing any preaching or speaking anymore. I was like facilitating the groups and helping them to run. But I was like, I don't feel comfortable teaching this. And it was a difficult, like that few months was quite a difficult place to be in. And I ended up, even though like I had like a final date that I was working towards anyway, I did end up leaving like a month early because it got to a point where I just thought I can't
do it anymore.
I can't do it anymore. Like even just being in that role, like even just being like a Christian in the eyes of the church and the youth group and stuff. I thought like it was actually, I remember because I was already on Twitter by this point. I think I made my Twitter account and blog around June time. So that was a couple of months sort of before I finished the job. So I feel quite bad, but I'd have these moments where I'd be sort of like running the youth group on Zoom, and I'd just be like checking my phone like at the side, like, tweeting things, which was just this real sort of like mess in my head. So that was quite difficult. And there was one point, it wasn't while I was at the youth meeting, but on a separate point, I was going through Twitter, and there was someone who basically sort of similar to a thing that I retweeted recently, where they said, oh, one of the joys of heaven is going to be knowing about the judgment of those in hell.
Right.
And I think I cracked at that point. Even though people at my church would not say, like, people at my church wouldn't say that. And like, there's a few people that do follow me on Twitter that I actually know in real life from my church, and they similarly were like, oh yeah, no, that's awful. Even though that's not something that my church would teach, I still was like, I can't be associated with this anymore, with any kind of a view that would at least think that view is plausible, that would even contemplate the idea of finding joy in the eternal suffering of others. I just thought that's too much. And at that point I was like, I've got to finish. I've got to finish this early. So I did. And that was all fine, because by then it was summer and the youth groups weren't really meeting. So
it's okay to question. God can take it.
yeah, that's a fun phrase, isn't it? And yeah, like that's the problem with a lot of the approaches. I think like that sort of with my video the other day is there's this idea that the you can question as much as you want, you can question, but you're ultimately going to get back to Jesus. Like these things are difficult, and we have questions around them, but and that's not what my experience ultimately was. That's kind of what it was for a while, especially like studying theology. You'll have big questions about this kind of stuff, and like with people over like lunch and dinner, because they're all like at the same lectures, and you're like, oh, isn't that interesting? And you have questions about, oh, what do you think about this or that? But no one really doubts that God exists. Like or if they do, they in fact, I've since chatted to a few people on my uni course who were going through similar things to me, but similarly didn't feel able to voice that. But yeah, it's paying lip service to doubting, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that a lot too. Where but really, it is like it's like you can doubt as long as you come to the right conclusions.
Yeah, and what? Another thing that really frustrated me, and I can't remember at what point in my journey this was, but I think I also remember it would often happen. I'd get back because I was living with my family last year, because the church I was working at actually was the church that I grew up in, so that was an extra like fun dynamic with that. But I got back in after. I think I'd had like a distance meet with one of my friends where we'd sit in a park and I'd have a bottle of whiskey and have a few glasses, which has been nice. And I remember getting back and sort of seeing this magazine, because we have this magazine, Christianity Today. No, it's not. It's Premier Christianity, which is different from Christianity Today. And there was an article, and like I just remember being like, oh, this is hopeful, because there was something about deconstruction. And I was reading through it, and I think the headspace I was in, I wasn't really thinking critically. I was like, well, this looks interesting. So I sort of flicked through it. And at first I was like, this is great. It's talking all about like this stuff that I feel like I'm going through, like deconstruction and leaving behind these kind of past ideas. And I got to the end, and basically the message of the article was, but you have to make sure that you reconstruct, because otherwise you'll just end up becoming like a liberal Christian or an atheist. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, what does reconstruction mean if you build back to exactly what you left? Right. Like the fact that they weren't even allowing you to have a different form of Christianity seemed bizarre to me. So I remember just being so frustrated, like when I saw that, and I feel like that was maybe again before I was perhaps admitting to myself that my doubts went deeper. So I think it was, yeah. I just all I really remember is that feeling of frustration of it started so well. This idea, like encouraging people, like, yeah, you can question, you can deconstruct, but then the typical thing of like, as long as you end up in pretty much exactly the same place as you were before. Right. And I think that's the problem with a lot of, I think, the church's approach to this. It pays lip service to doubting. It doesn't really allow questioning to go to where it would naturally go. Like it doesn't sort of take it to its conclusion, which I think is kind of just more frustrating than anything.
Yeah, you had also mentioned. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I just say because at least with the other approaches where they're like you can't question, like you cannot, then at least once you get past that hurdle, you're like, oh yeah, I can. Like screw you.
Right.
Whereas I think with the sort of lighter approach, if you can question, like it's more difficult to rage against that because it feels like they're permitting you to do it.
Right.
Whereas in reality, they're kind of giving you the same straitjacket to put on, but they're just not calling it that. But yeah.
Exactly. I was going to say, like you mentioned, like, the fundamentalist approaches where you might like living under this kind of, obvious straitjacket. People can just, once they start questioning, it's over. People are like, screw this. I don't need to believe this. And so I think people see that, having too much of a straitjacket is kind of like piles on the cognitive dissonance on a lot of people. And so they're like trying to like, loosen the straitjacket a little bit to say like, no, yeah, like you said, you can question, just make sure Jesus,
make sure you end up at exactly this place.
Right.
It's honest questioning, but it must honestly reach this point that you want it to reach. Yeah.
So, and you mentioned it briefly, but let's come back to like the importance of like coming out, and how that related to deconversion and stuff. You want to talk a little bit more about that and like your experience with your friends and family and all that?
Yeah. So I came out initially when I was 18, so 7 years ago now. Quite a while, really. And it was on Christmas Eve, so it wasn't that long since I celebrated the anniversary. And it was just after I had started working as a youth intern. So I just sort of like started that role. And I'd come back for Christmas, and I basically, first of all, chatted to one of my close friends. And she actually, interestingly, like she took it fine in terms of like, I remember her first reaction was basically, oh shit. but basically because she was worried for me, because she knew that I wanted to work in the church, and she knew that all of that reaction. So she herself is certainly very progressive, and like we've when we've spoken more recently, it's been really interesting, like hearing her thoughts on like Christianity. And there was actually one point, like I remember a few years ago, where we met up in the midst of like my studies at university, and I was going through this horrible kind of like purity phase where this whole idea, I think we were doing a module on like purity and holiness, and it just made me think, maybe I should just give up everything for God. Maybe they're right. And
Jesus
like,
is your husband.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I've got Jesus, what else do I need? Like, right. That's why all of these other pastors are all entirely single, and don't have wives or husbands. To be fair, the Catholics don't. So I guess they're at least being a bit more consistent in their approach. But yeah, so and we kind of almost fell out there, because she was like, can't you see how damaging this is for you? And I was like, no, like purity, all of that kind of stuff is great. So she was a good first person to come out to. And then later that day I came out to my family as well. And they're like very open and progressive. So there was no problem there. And they reassured me that they still loved me, and it didn't change anything. Or my sister, in fact, actually, like she is in a similar thing to me. She doesn't believe, and she never really did. Like, so she didn't really engage in youth groups and stuff. So she was delighted. But yeah, my parents who do believe, like that was fine. And over the course of the next sort of year or so, I gradually started telling more and more people. Interesting, there are a few people that I wanted to tell, I never got round to. And like a few years on, it just got more and more difficult to just bring it up out of nowhere. And actually, I sort of did a post on Facebook, I think must be 4 or 5 months ago now. I think it was around sort of August, September. And that was a post about not being a Christian anymore, but it also briefly alluded to me being gay. And there's a lot of people that like just didn't know as well.
Right.
So it was, for a lot of people, it was kind of like a big thing there. But yeah, I always want to reiterate, like whenever I told people, like I got nothing except like love in return. And like, I'm always super grateful for that. Like it always breaks my heart when I see these stories of people who are rejected by their friends or family because of it. And, it changes everything for them. It didn't for me. Like, it it was quite nice finally being able to be open and honest with my friends about like how I was feeling, and it changed dynamics slightly when it got into like relationship talk, but like no one ostracized me because of it. Like no one rejected me as a friend or anything. So I always recognize how incredibly fortunate I am that was the case. And to be honest, I always put it down as a testament to the good quality of people that I surround myself with. Like I always feel like I choose good friends. So I'm always pleased with that. But yeah, the real struggle for me was internally. And initially that wasn't like a big problem for me. I think when I first came out, it was more just trying to work out my identity. Like, who am I? Like, what does this actually mean for me? And just trying to figure out these things that didn't seem to make sense for the first 18 years of my life. Like, why do I feel this way? Why all of this? Suddenly, like, making sense of that. I'm like, oh, this is why. Like, okay, it makes sense now. So when I was like doing my internship, like a lot of that was kind of just figuring out myself, which is quite handy to have that kind of space to do that. And then when I studied theology a couple of years later, and I was more confident in who I was, so I wasn't like at that point trying to shy away from it or try and justify it. I was like, I am who I am. I was then trying to work out what does that mean theologically. That was, I think, where a lot of the big issues kind of came up, because again, I was never like super open at university. Like I think about halfway through my first year, I came out to one of my friends, and then sort of over the course of a few years, I came out to a few more, but I was never like just, loud and proud, as it were. It was always just more of like a thing that I told my confidants, but that was as far as it went. And again, they were all perfectly accepting, but there was also for some of them this reality that we still had different theological understandings,
right?
And that they were fine with me being who I was, and if I was in a relationship, like they wouldn't have like hated me or ostracized me for it, but I knew that they would not have been super comfortable with it, and they would have probably been thinking like, oh, that's not right, and whatever. Not all of them. Some of my friends probably would have just been very affirming, and actually like since even more recently, like I'm aware of quite how affirming a lot of my friends are, which is again great. But a lot of it was me just trying to reconcile it, and ultimately I couldn't. That was the problem. I spent a long time trying to be like, well, theologically, is it possible that like we've reinterpreted certain passages, or if we just got a wrong understanding of it? And before I left, I did my master's, and you have access to all of these articles, which is amazing because you get like free access to all of the resources. And I was like, oh no, in a few weeks I'm not going to have access to this anymore. So I basically desperately put together like a bibliography, and I don't know if this is illegal, so if anyone is watching and is publishing things, please don't arrest me for it. But I basically downloaded a whole load of articles that I could then sort of reference around this kind of area to do with sort of sexuality. And I try to look at it from like a biblical point of view, more like a systematic point of view. Like I downloaded a few things about more contemporary pastoral approaches, and even some like scientific things. I didn't get that far. I got into, I mainly stayed in the biblical stuff, but the more I read, the more I just thought, you can't justify it as a Christian. Like the bottom line is, it pains me to say it in some ways, but the Bible is homophobic. Like, and those who try and rationalize it otherwise, I think, are doing a noble task. And if they ever succeed and convince me and everyone else that you can like be a Christian and not have to implicitly kind of subscribe to these things, like that would be great. But all of the things that I read trying to defend it either just didn't really approach the biblical things at all, and dismissed them, or like the hermeneutics they used, I was not convinced by. I just thought it's kind of a hermeneutical gymnastics is the phrase I think that sums it up quite nice. It'll be appeals to some kind of vague use of a term in one other ancient text, and some kind of Hebrew word that could mean this. And I hate the term plain reading of scripture, because plain reading generally means one person's plain reading, which is not someone else's. But I think there's also a point where, like, on one extreme, like, yeah, maybe you don't want to have just, I think you were talking about this actually. I think I'm probably paraphrasing you. So where you're saying like, you don't want to have just like a plain, this is what it is. But then on the other hand, I think you said, like, it's also more difficult to follow those who kind of just try and entirely rationalize it away to the point where, like, the text is almost indiscernible and you can just rationalize whatever you want.
Yeah.
And I think that's what my experience was. I found that, like, yeah, I found either way was a bit difficult. And
there's some people that would say, you know, like Paul was wrong and the Bible's still inspired because now we can learn from this. You know, he was a man of his time, and we can learn from the fact that, you know, even one of God's, you know, people can be wrong about, you know, like there's ways to do it without actually saying that it teaches that homosexuality is okay. But even then, like I said, that to me, there's no way to falsify that other than to say we don't need to appeal to a divine explanation. Paul was just wrong because he was a man. You know, we don't need to add on the claim that also, by the way, God inspired this.
And it does rest just on your understanding of biblical inspiration, I think, really. So it's caught up in that whole kind of mess. And one of the things about deconstructing and deconverting from that was just how refreshing it was to be able to step aside from that whole confusing, chaotic bubble where things have to make sense and things have to work, and being like, you know what, they don't. They don't have to add up. Like, so
I can take a deep breath and just say I don't know about
and I think my first blog post back last July was just titled I don't know, because I think that kind of summarizes a lot of where I've been at, like, this last period of time. Like, it was really interesting. I was watching John Steingard's chat with Phil. What's his name? I can't remember his name now. But he runs, like, the deconstructing sort of network, and he was explaining, like, these different stages of deconstruction. I want to say Phil Collins, but that's a drummer. And one of the things about that is the last stage you arrive at, like, the beliefs that you hold, you don't hold to the same degree of certainty as the ones you left. So it's not like you're just leaving one form of fundamentalism or one form of belief in exchange for another, but it's actually part of deconstruction seems to be this idea that you hold on to your new beliefs a lot more lightly than the other ones. And I think that is what I've kind of experienced a lot more recently, is this idea that actually, like, I don't know. And I'm quite hesitant as well with a lot of, like, the philosophical debates that I see going on. Like, I'm quite hesitant to get into them, because I think, like, you could kind of use the kalam or contingency, or I'm still not 100% sure I know what kalam means. I think I watched a video or two and I'm like, okay, I kind of get it, but they all seem kind of the same. That's what a lot of the arguments for God sort of seem kind of the same, of, like, there are things, you know, things have a beginning, things have a purpose, therefore, you know, there's some big purpose maker out there that makes them all make sense. And so all of those kind of arguments, I'm like, I suppose you could go down that line and you could kind of be sort of sit there very satisfied that you've proven God with the use of clever rhetoric and sort of abstract logic. But I think at some point you've got to be like, yeah, we don't really know though, do we?
Right. Well, that's what's funny to me, like, with the philosophy stuff, like, my deconversion was also mostly Bible and miracle based.
Right.
It was more, I mean, there were some experiences that shook me out of my certainty, but it was mostly like, the things that made the resurrection plausible to me as a miracle event were that it seemed to me that there was prophecy for Jesus, like in the Old Testament, that was really clear. You know, at the time I thought that's not anymore. You know, that it seemed to me that this book was, like, unlike other collections of texts, there's all these undergirding beliefs. And once those undergirding beliefs kind of fell away, I was like, I was always naturally skeptical of miracle claims anyway. And the thing that made the resurrection plausible was a lot of, like, it's kind of like a foundation of other beliefs. And so once you pull away the foundation, all you have is the evidence for the resurrection. I just don't think that evidence is that good, you know, like, on its own.
Yeah. That is interesting, because it's quite a I'm trying to think of the term, because I remember I learned it in my apologetics class, where it's like one type supports another, a cumulative case.
Right.
And that's what I think. I mean, it sounds like that, like you say, for you, it like one thing was reliant on another, and when that sort of comes away, then you think, well, why did I believe this in the first place? And I think, Yeah, it's almost like the contingency argument of leaving Christianity, isn't it? Like all of these things seem contingent on one another, and then you realize there is no cause. There is no first cause in the first place, and all of these things you initially believed, like biblical inspiration and the resurrection, like ultimately, like they're all contingent on something. But then when you get down to what they're contingent on, there's not really anything there. And I think most people, and this is where it's different for me, I guess, a lot of people have this idea of like their relationship with Jesus. And that's kind of what a lot of it, when you try and pull it down to, like, a lot of people might say they don't believe in the resurrection because of actually the Old Testament miracles, or because of like the textual evidence. They might say, well, I know Jesus, like, I'm friends with him, whatever, like chat to him every day, like, therefore, of course he raised from the dead. Like it's a no-brainer. And I never really had that kind of experience of, an intimate relationship with Jesus. I only had questionable sort of things of, was that God? Could that voice be? So that was another thing that, it was never really a foundation to lean on when these things, like contingencies were sort of stripped away. But
you were never saved.
Well, yeah.
No,
and maybe, and actually, I think like, I think it's quite a, in a sense, if you believe in Calvinism,
right?
I was chatting to a friend yesterday, and he said about how he believes in Calvinism, but is not a Christian. Like it's almost, it takes the pressure off of you, doesn't it? You're like, well, it's kind of on God. If God's damned me, there's nothing I can do about it. So I might as well make the most of what I've got of life before I sort of go through the eternal conscious torment, because that's not going to be fun. So let's just have a glass of whiskey and ride it out,
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting though, like kind of going back a little bit, because when I deconverted, I kind of identified as an agnostic initially, and so I was into apologetics and stuff like that. I'd read William Lane Craig and all that stuff, but because it was mostly Bible and miracle issues, I kind of had space to explore like philosophy of religion, which is what I'm reading a lot of now. I mean, now I would consider myself an atheist, but that's after I actually was starting to read like all the more technical debates about all that stuff. But it was nice, because I was like, okay, I don't believe in Christianity, but let's explore some of this other stuff, and just, you kind of don't have to, like, it was freeing for me, because I felt like I could actually, like, I don't have to like be pinned down to the position. I can actually just listen and see what people have to say and make up my own mind. And it was kind of freeing in that way. And yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah, and actually that's kind of been my experience in a way with religions generally, like with because one of the things I'm going into now with teaching religions is I've kind of got to know a bit about them. I realized like a year ago, I was like, I don't know the first thing about Islam or Hinduism or all of that. So I had to like desperately read up on it. And like you say, it's quite nice to approach it without sort of almost having a conclusion about its truth value, because you can read like, around these other areas, but like, as a Christian, you kind of like, well, yeah, but Jesus, he's the way, the truth, and the life. So if it doesn't like conform to that, then it's obviously not true. Whereas it's quite freeing to not be tied to a particular view that you have to adhere to, and be like, well, at the end of the day, it has to line up with this. And I'm not a Buddhist. Like I've not suddenly switched to that position, but it's quite nice reading into those kind of things. Even outside of like philosophy of religion and stuff, just more broadly, which similarly I'm going to have to read into, because I'm going to have to teach it, and I don't know a lot about it. And it's one of the terrifying things that I've been looking at recently. We had a quiz on Zoom with like other student teachers about philosophers, and like, which philosopher said this, and when were they born, and what idea do they subscribe to? And I was like, I've got a few friends that I know would love this, they would nail it, but I don't know the first thing about it. But yeah, it's that freedom to be able to explore it and be like, well, let's just take it on its own merit, like rather than judging in advance, like, well, it's got to be true or not, whether it conforms to Christianity. Let's be like, well, does it make sense? Like, is it something that could be helpful to sort of have as something you that guides you in life? So it's nice to have that approach, I think.
Yeah. Just briefly talking about it, you mentioned like not having super intimate or super realistic religious experience. I mean, I had like religious experience where I sensed God's presence, in a sense, or like had some, but it's still like, for me, the kind of crack in that foundation was actually meeting a lot of other people that were religious or in what I would consider cults, just different beliefs, and like talking with them, and like at least someone could always say like, well, they're not really having religious experiences, or they're deceived or whatever. But like to me, it seemed like what they were describing was what I was experiencing, but they were for a different set of beliefs, and it gave them confidence in those beliefs. And so I was like, like maybe human beings are just more complicated than I thought, and maybe this is not actually pointing to something that's true out there. It might just be that I'm having experiences that are common when people engage in certain kind of like ritual and religious beliefs. So
and it's so that whole kind of area of like religious experience and stuff is actually one thing that I've been finding more difficult to get to grips with. Not necessarily like my own, because like I said, I didn't really have anything beyond the kind of what the Wesleyan. My heart was strangely warmed, which I think, well, my heart gets strangely warmed in a whole variety of circumstances. Like, so I don't know why I would pin that down to God. But yeah, I never really had anything that would convince me personally. But I have heard stories of like people who've like had healings or seen like the demonic or stuff, and I have been wrestling with that along. And I've come to similar conclusions, I think, to you, in the idea that we are just very complicated. And it's in a way, it's quite difficult to comment on it with any kind of authority without actually understanding psychology, which I don't. It's one of the many areas that I would love to read into and understand more. But until I have to teach a class on it, I'm probably not going to get around to actually researching it in reality. So I can't offer an explanation for being like, oh, this experience is down to these chemicals or whatever. Like, there's people out there who I'm sure are very capable of explaining it in that way. But I think, like you say, I think it just comes down to the fact that we're very complicated. And I think that we're sometimes hesitant to admit that. And therefore, when something happens, which is, a little bit unusual and not part of our normal everyday 24/7 experience, we sort of think, oh, well, there must be something divine or supernatural is the cause of this. Like, we don't think, oh, maybe people are just sporadic sometimes, and maybe the way we're feeling at one point is not how we feel at another point. But at the same time, there are some things that I think, I don't know how I would explain this, and I find it difficult to know how it would be explained, especially when it comes to things like healings, or other things. For example, so one of the conversations I had on my blog was with a friend who I went to university with, who was actually very openly gay. So it was just an interesting conversation, but he's still a Christian. And I asked, like, why are you still basically quite funny. So why? Like, why would you still be, you've gone through what I've gone through. And one of the things he said was because like what God's done for him. And I, again, tried to push that a little bit more. Like, what do you mean? Like, what specifically has he done for you? And there's one story that he told where basically this person came up to him and told him 3 things about his life that like secrets basically of his life that this guy had not told anyone. This was a stranger like coming up to him. And then later he sort of asked, like, well, why did you tell me these things? And he said, oh, because God loves you and he wants you to know that he cares for you, and that kind of stuff. And I think, part of me is like, oh, but then another part is like, well, how else do you explain it? Like, I don't know. Like, if these are, and I was speaking to someone who said, like, with a story face like that, I guess you'd want all the facts. You want to know who was this person, like, what were the things they told them, like, what was the exact wording they used, how close is it? So there are lots of other things you'd want to explore, but assuming that like the story is told sort of accurately, and assuming that if it was enough to make them surprised, like you'd have to sort of think, and it makes me think, well, maybe there's a perfectly natural explanation that we don't yet understand of just how complicated we are. And part of me wonders, like, is there some kind of and this is where I start to sound crazy, because I wonder, like, is there some kind of weird telepathic ability that we have as humans? Is there like some kind of energy that we share, that we somehow are able to, not telepathy in the way of like, you can read someone's mind, but I don't know, like, is there some way that we're able to get sort of similar thought processes if we're in close proximity, and maybe that's subconsciously? But again, that's purely me, with a tinfoil hat on my head, hypothesizing. simply because I don't know what other explanations there are beyond, like, maybe there is some kind of divinity that gave someone this word of knowledge. Like, it's difficult, but maybe that's where we have to be satisfied with not knowing.
Yeah.
But it has been those kind of things have been a little bit of a spanner in the works in my deconstruction, because on a purely like theological, biblical, personal experiential point of view, I'm perfectly happy to leave all of like the Christian stuff behind. But it's when I hear certain stories within a Christian context and framework that I find difficult to explain, I then think, what if there is something to it that I've just missed out on, or I've approached the wrong way? So that's been a more difficult area, I think, for me.
The cynicism in me is just like, I mean, those charismatic people, well, not all of them, but a lot of them do go up to strangers and just say things a lot. You're bound to get one, depending on how vague the statements were. Like, I know you're hiding a dark secret, or like if you say something vague, if you say something vague enough to enough people, they're gonna be like, oh my, how did you know that? Like, it's like, I mean,
it's maybe principle, isn't it? I guess, like, yeah. And you will be convinced because you're the one that they happen to get it right.
Right.
And all the others who they just got it completely off, just
right.
They wouldn't give it another thought. So yeah, so that is one way you can explain it. And from a naturalistic point of view, that is probably one of the more plausible ones, that they are saying things, maybe they came up to enough people like with the same things, and at one point it was bound to stick, because if you got like 2.5 of them pretty close, you're still going to be quite impressed. Like, right. Out of 3, so yeah, I think that's certainly one approach that you could take to that.
Well, we've been going over a little over an hour, excuse me. But I appreciate you coming on. We can chat a little bit after this, after I like actually end the recording. But
yeah, happily.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on and taking the time. This was fun.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.